What's going on, guys? Welcome to my Sass crash course. Now, I've done a bunch of projects on my channel and in courses using Sass. However, I've never done an actual crash course dedicated to it. So I wanted to do that for people just getting into learning Sass. So we're going to talk about what it is, some of its benefits and features, how to get set up, and how to compile Sass down to regular CSS. And we're going to create just a simple project that will implement most of the features like variables, nesting, inheritance, and so on. And there's other CSS preprocessors similar to Sass. You have Less, you have Stylus, there's some other ones as well, but Sass is definitely the most popular, and that's what I would recommend learning over the others. So let's talk a little bit about what Sass is. It stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets, and it's what's called a CSS preprocessor, or sometimes referred to as a CSS language or a CSS extension. And it basically allows you to go beyond the natural capabilities of CSS. It allows your CSS to act more like an actual programming language, and you write more efficient CSS with Sass. We can even have logic, conditionals with logic and functions and stuff like that, which I'll show you later on. Now, it's important to know that the browser doesn't read Sass files directly, so it has to be compiled down to regular CSS. And in order to do that, you need some kind of Sass compiler. And you have a ton of choices when it comes to this. What I'm going to show you is the basic NPM module, so we can install Sass with NPM, and we can compile it with that through the command line. But then I'm going to show you my preferred way, which is right in VS Code. There's an extension called Live Sass Compiler that will do it right on the fly, and that's usually what I use. But there's a lot of other options. You can implement it in your the workflow of your application if you're using like Gulp or something like that. If you're using React or some kind of framework. So lots of different options. Now, when it comes to writing Sass, there's basically two different methods, and there's two different file extensions. So we have .scss files, which is what I'll be using. This seems to be the preferred because it's basically backwards compatible with regular CSS. It has the curly braces, as you can see, so it's formatted just like CSS. You just have some extra abilities. You can nest, you can use variables like you see here, and then you also have the option of using a .sass file where instead of using curly braces, we use indentation. You can see this body selector, there's no curly braces, the styles are indented. And I don't really like this method. I've pretty much never used it, but some developers do prefer it, especially if you're into like the Pug template engine where you use this kind of style for your markup. But like I said, I don't really use this method, so we're going to stick to the SCSS files. So I just want to quickly go over some of the features of Sass before we jump in and I give you some examples. So first we have variables. Now it's important to mention that CSS itself, just regular CSS, does now have the ability to use variables. They're actually called custom properties. I do have a video on that if you're interested. However, the syntax isn't very pretty. Sass allows us to do it in a much easier, more readable way. We just simply use a $ and then the variable, and then we can put any styles that we want. So here we have a font stack, here we have a primary color, and we can use those anywhere within our selectors in our CSS. Okay, so I mean, if you have a color that's going to repeat throughout your CSS, then it's good to have a variable so you can just edit it up here instead of going through and editing all the values. So nesting is one of the main reasons that I like to use Sass. Instead of repeating the CSS selector with the children like nav-ul, nav-li, nav-a, you can simply nest the children, the child selectors in the parent like this. So we just have a nav tag, then we have a ul, li, and a, and these will only pertain to the ul, li, and a tags that are within a nav tag. And obviously you can use classes and IDs and so on as well. So next we have modules and partials. Basically we can break up our CSS into separate files, or our Sass I should say, and then bring them all into some kind of main Sass file. Now, unlike plain CSS imports, because you can import files with regular CSS, but when you do that, it makes multiple HTTP requests as it renders your page. With Sass, the imports are handled entirely during compilation, so you end up with just this one big Sass CSS file that you then upload to your server. So this is great for creating, CSS components like buttons and alerts. You can have a separate file for all of your CSS components, or even break it up into pages if you want an about.sass or SCSS file or a contact.scss file. You can do that, and as long as you put an underscore in the name, it's not going to compile that file. The Sass compiler will ignore it, and you can just import it or use it in another Sass file. So like I said, Sass makes your CSS more like an actual programming language. We have functions and mixins, which allow you to create blocks of CSS that you can run wherever you want, just like you would a function in some type of programming language. So this example is actually a mixin called transform, which takes in a parameter. You can have parameters just like regular functions, and it gets passed in a property. You can see over here or down here, it's being used to pass in a transform property. And then what we're doing is just adding this to the different prefixes for the different browsers, as well as just the regular transform property. And it's going to add it to all of those. Now, instead of having to do these 3 lines wherever you want to use this, you can simply include the mixin. Now, functions work in a very similar way, except with functions they actually return something. A mixin, you're just pretty much placing the CSS there. With a function you can return something, and I'm going to give you an example of that later on. Also, with functions you don't actually need to use this include here. So inheritance or extending is another really cool feature of Sass. Now, a lot of times you'll have elements like buttons or alert messages where you'll have like different colors and stuff, but the base of it will all be the same. So in this case, we have these messages. We have success, error, warning, and they're all going to have this style with the border, the padding, the color, and so on. So what we can do is just create that base, the base styles, and then we can extend them into these other classes. So for success, we're going to extend all this stuff here, but also add a green border. For error, a red border. For warning, a yellow border. Okay, so it makes it easier to create alerts and buttons and stuff like that. Now we also have the ability to use operators. Honestly, I don't use this feature very much, but we have the ability to do calculations. This is an example where we're calculating floats, although I mean I haven't used floats in probably a couple years, but we do have the ability to use operators for different things. So we also have the ability to use conditionals, which again makes Sass more like an actual programming language, because we can have logic. We can have if statements and if-else statements in our CSS. And we may only want to have a certain style if a certain condition is met, and this is something that's very helpful in our styling. So here it's actually a mixin that takes in some parameters, and we're just checking the direction to see if it equals up. If it does, then we're going to add a border bottom color. If it's right, then we'll add border left, and so on. So this can be very, very helpful in our styling. Okay, so enough with the slides. I don't want to bore you to death. Let's jump in and let's take a look at Sass. Okay, so what I wanted to do here is something pretty simple. I didn't want to do like a whole website or anything like that. So what I did is I took part of a landing page from a theme site called themesbrand.com and just copied the header basically. And just with this right here, we're going to implement pretty much everything that I've talked about: variables, nesting, partials and functions, mixins, things like that. So it's not much as far as what we're creating, but we're gonna use quite a bit of Sass and regular CSS. So if you're not that familiar with CSS, I would definitely suggest watching my CSS crash course first. Okay, so let's jump into VS Code. And what I have here is just the HTML. I haven't created anything else, just an index HTML file. If you want to copy this, you can. If you want to get it from the code pen in the description, you can. But basically, we're including a file here that's going to be in a CSS folder and then style.css, so just a regular CSS file that doesn't exist yet. And then we just basically have a header that wraps around everything with the class of showcase. We have a container so that we can push everything to the middle. We have a nav that has an H1 with our logo. It's basically just text. And then a UL for the menu. And then we have a div with the class of showcase content that includes a div with our content like the heading, the paragraph, the buttons, and then an image from the themes brand template. Okay, and notice some of these classes: BTN primary, BTN secondary, MY1. This will make more sense later on. So that's the HTML, and we can go ahead and open this up. You can either open it on your file system, or you can use Live Server, which is what I'm using, which is a VS Code extension. Okay, so if I open it up, that's what it looks like. That's just the HTML. Now, to get started with Sass, let's create a folder here called SCSS. And in here, we're going to create a file called style.scss. Make sure you use that extension. And if you're using VS Code, you should see the little Sass icon. And then I'm just going to create a folder in the root called CSS as well. Okay, no, I'm not going to create any files. I'm just going to create the folder. Now, in here, let's just add some base styling for now. So we'll add a reset, let's say box sizing, border box. And I'm not going to explain all the CSS. You should have decent knowledge in CSS. We're just resetting the margin and padding here. And then let's add a little bit of Sass. So I'm just going to create a variable called light color and set that to F4 3 times. And then in the body, we'll create a background color and set that to our variable of light color. And then I'm also just going to add the font family. We'll use Arial and a line height of, let's say, 1.6. And as far as variables go, I mean, it's up to you what you want to put in them. I usually use variables where it's something I'll use over and over, like this light color I might use in, I don't know, a card header or something like that, or a button. So that's usually when I use variables. But of course, you could put anything in a variable. We could take this font stack, like you saw they did in the documentation. We could take that and say font stack and set that. So any CSS styles you can set into a variable. Now, obviously this is not regular CSS, and we can't include a Sass file or an SCSS file. We can't do this. So we need a compiler. And like I told you, I'm going to show you 2 different ways. I prefer the VS Code extension Live Sass compiler, but just in case you're not using VS Code, I'm going to show you how to use the npm module. So if you open up a terminal, and obviously you need Node.js installed because you need access to npm, which is the Node package manager, we can say sudo, because I'm going to install this globally, npm install -g for global Sass. And installing it globally will give us access to the Sass command. So I can say sass -- watch, because I want to continue to watch my Sass file. We need to specify where that Sass file is, which is style.scss, and then the output, which is going to be css style.css. So if I go ahead and run that, we get a message that says it compiled it, and also it's watching for changes. So if I change anything in here, it'll compile. So if we look in CSS now, in our folder, it created 2 files. One is this map file. This is a source map. Usually I disable these. I don't even really use source maps with Sass, but you do have the option. And then it created a style CSS. And if we look at this, it's just regular CSS. There's no variables or anything. It basically just replaced those values with whatever the value was, excuse me, inside of our variable. Okay, now you want to be sure you don't edit your CSS file, because that's going to keep getting recompiled. If I change something here, like I change this variable to red and I save and I go back to style CSS, now that's red. So you don't want to ever touch your CSS when you're dealing with Sass. Okay, let's just set that back. Now, I'm not going to use this Sass module, so I'm going to Control-C to stop this. And then I'm going to just delete the 2 files that it generated. And I'm going to show you the VS Code extension. So if you go to the extensions icon here and you search for Live Sass, you'll see this Live Sass compiler. And this is what I would recommend using because it's just really easy and it's a really nice extension, especially in combination with Live Server. So if you install that, excuse me, which I already have installed, you'll see this Watch Sass button. Now before I click that, I just want to show you in my settings. If we search for Live Sass, so right here, Live Sass compiler, we actually want to go to the settings.json. So I have a bunch of settings here, but the ones I want you to look at are these. So these have to do with the Live Sass compiler. This is just setting the source maps to false, so it won't generate any source maps. And then in here, in this .formats array, we have an object that has a format of compressed. Okay, there's other options. I forget the other options, but compress will just make it basically minified. It'll scrunch it all together, make a smaller file size. If you want the extension to be min.css, if you wanted to generate that, you can do so. I'm not. You can see I have that commented out. And then the save path is where it will get compiled, which for me is going to be in this CSS folder in my root. You might have like a dist folder or something, and you can change that if you want. But those are my settings, so if you want to copy those, you can. And then I'm just going to close that up, and we'll go ahead and click Watch Sass. So now what happened is it compiled it. You can see the style.css it created, and it's also going to continuously watch my Sass file. And if we look at what it generated regular CSS that is compressed or minified. Okay, so it's all scrunched together. You don't have to do that. You can change the setting if you want. All right, and if we make a mistake, like let's say I don't have a value here and I save, it should tell me that down here in the terminal or in the output. You can see the error. It'll also show it in the Problems tab, variable value expected. Okay, so it's just a really cool extension and gives you a really nice workflow. Okay, and as I save, Live Server will also update. You can see we have the gray background, we have the Arial font, and so on. So let's continue to basically build this landing page using Sass. And obviously I'm going to use some regular CSS as well. I'm going to use Flexbox to align some stuff and so on. But let's create a couple more variables. I'm going to have a primary color, and my primary color is going to be that blue. So that's going to be hexadecimal 0E6CFF is my primary, and then I'm also going to have a secondary color, and that's going to be that orange color. So that's FF8700. Okay, and then let's see, we're going to use that in our header. So down here we have a class of showcase, which is the header that wraps everything. And I'm going to set the background color to my primary color. Okay, and then we'll set the color of the text to white, and I'm going to set a height of 600 pixels. So if I save that, you can see that that takes effect. Now I want to work on the container because I want to push everything into the middle. And the container is basically going to be in the root level. I'm not going to nest it within Showcase because you might want to use this somewhere else as well. So it's basically a utility class. So let's say max width 1100 pixels, and let's do padding 0, 30 pixels on the left and right, auto left and right, push it in the middle, and then we'll just set an overflow of hidden, or overflow of auto. All right, so if we take a look, now everything is pushed to the middle. And I'm just going to make sure the image is 100% of its container. So we'll just set width of any image to 100%. So now I want to continue to work on the showcase stuff. So the showcase has the nav in it. It has the showcase content, which is all this stuff right here. So let's work on the nav bar here. Now, since the nav is inside of showcase, we can go ahead and nest it, because usually what we would do is something like showcase nav or showcase UL or LI, whatever child that we wanted to style inside the showcase, we would have to create a separate block for. But we can go ahead and nest this in here like that, okay? And this will only pertain to nav tags that are inside the showcase class. So I'm going to display flex here because I want everything aligned horizontal. And then we'll set align items to center and then justify content. Remember, we have two flex items. I know this isn't a Flexbox course, but the two flex items in the nav are the logo and the UL, and we want them separated on each side, so we're going to set this to space between. So if I save that and we take a look, now the logo's over here, the UL is over here. Now the UL I also want as a flex box so that the items will align horizontal. So let's go within the showcase, within the nav, and nest the UL. So now this UL only pertains to ULs inside the nav, inside the showcase class. So let's say display flex, and I'm going, actually we don't need that. Let's do list style none. And then for the LIs, we have the choice to either nest it in here, but I think it's a little neater if we put it outside of it. This is still going to only be LIs that are in the showcase nav, but it's up to you on how you want to nest it. And I'm just going to add a padding to separate them out, so 15 pixels. And if we look, now we have our nav with our links that are horizontal. Now let's take care of the coloring and the underline. So the underline, I'm actually going to put that as a global style, so all links. We want to remove, let's see, text decoration, none. And for the colors of the links, let's see, I'm just going to put inside the showcase outside of the nav, because I want even links that are outside of the nav, I want them to have a color of white. Actually, yeah, we can do that. Now these are white too, the buttons. All right, but I do want to have a hover color of the secondary color, which is that orange. I want to have that for those, for the LIs. So what we can do is we can say any A tag that is hovered, excuse me, we can set the color to secondary color, and that will only pertain to the nav links. So let's go back, and there we go. It doesn't do that here. Okay, so let's move on from the nav bar to the showcase content area. Now, showcase content, that class is within showcase, right? If we look at our HTML, we have showcase, and showcase content is within it. So we can nest that in here. So we want to go, let's see, after the nav, after the A, and we could do showcase dash content. Now I want to show you that we can use the ampersand basically as a shortcut for the parent. Since this class is called .showcase, we can actually replace .showcase with an ampersand if you want to do it like that. I do like to do this, and this will just render or compile as .showcase dash content. So let's set this to height of 100%, and I'm going to display this as flex because I want all the text on one side and then the image on another. So I want them displayed horizontal, and then let's align items center and justify content center. And if we take a look, you can see that it went ahead and did that. Now the image width, I want to set it to 50% because that's way too big. It's 100 by default. So inside here, we'll go ahead and nest image and set that width to 50%. Okay, so that's better. I also want to make the H1 a little bigger and add some margin on the paragraph. So let's do that. Let's say H1 inside the showcase content. We'll set the font size to, let's say, 50 pixels. And I'm just going to add a line height of 1.2 so that they're not too far apart when there's two lines. And then for the paragraph, let's set a margin top and bottom 20 pixels. Okay, and there we go. Now I want to, before we do these buttons, I want to show you how to use partials, because a lot of times you don't want just one big monolithic file with all your CSS. You can break it up into as many files as you want, and ultimately it compiles into one CSS file. It's not like you have to make a bunch of requests to your server. So inside my Sass folder, or SCSS folder, I'm going to create a file called _config.scss. And this is just what I like to do. I like to have a config that has any variables, mixins, functions, anything like that I like to put in that file. So I'm just going to cut this and put it inside here and save. Now it's not going to compile this to a config.css file because of the underscore. That underscore tells Sass that this is a partial, and that's what it's to be used for, a partial. It's to bring into another file. It's not to be compiled on its own like style SCSS. So we can go ahead and we can just import, and we can just say config. We don't even have to do underscore or .css, and that should still work. Okay, in fact, if I go into my config and I change my primary color to red and save, it should compile, and now you can see I have a red header. So, I mean, you can imagine if you have this really large website with different color buttons and headers and alerts and all that stuff, and you have this one config file, you can easily just change the entire look of your site by changing the values. So that's one of the biggest advantages of using Sass. And obviously breaking everything up into different files. In fact, I'm going to take my container, because this container is basically a utility, right? It's not part of any specific element like the showcase or nav or anything. So what I would do is create a new file here called _utilities.scss, and this would be for utility classes. Okay, anything that I don't want to give its own file, like the buttons, will give its own file. So in here we'll paste that in and save, and then we'll import that just like we did config. Okay, so our utilities classes, and then I'll have a file for our buttons. So we'll say import buttons, and then let's create that. Make sure you have an underscore because it's a partial. And now we'll go ahead and do our buttons. Now here I'm going to use inheritance, because with buttons a lot of times, you know, you'll have the same shared styles or base styles, and then you'll just have different colors or different borders. So if we look in our HTML, we have button primary and button secondary, which they're going to share a lot of styles. They're just going to be different colors. So inside buttons, I'm going to actually create some shared styles with percentage BTN, and you can extend classes and IDs. You don't have to use this % syntax, but I'm going to put everything in here that is going to be shared. Like I want to display inline block, I want them to have a border radius of 5 pixels, I want padding of 8 pixels, 20 pixels, and margin we'll do 3 pixels. And then for the hover, and we can just do ampersand : hover, because remember we're just using the parent and then the hover. And let's just add a transform here to scale it down a little bit. So we'll do 0.98. Okay, now these shared properties and values I want to use in btn-primary, and the way we use this is with @extend. So we can extend that percent button. Okay, and then we can do the same thing for secondary. So btn secondary, and then let's just change the background color, and this is going to use the primary color variable. Now we have access to these variables because in our main style SCSS we're including our config that has all the variables and then our buttons, so this file has access to this. Okay, because remember, it all gets compiled into one big CSS file here. So let's go back to buttons, and then we're gonna use the secondary color here. Now if I go back and we take a look at this, you can see we have the secondary color here and the primary here. However, the primary is the same as the, we're using the primary as the header background. So I want to use this opportunity to show you the lighten and darken functions. So if I go back here where we're setting the background to primary, I can use either darken or lighten and wrap this. And what these take, either lighten or darken, is a color, which in this case is primary color, and then a percentage. So what I'm going to say here is I want to lighten this color 10%. So if I save that and we go back, you can see that now this is, you can make this out because it's lighter than the primary color behind it. Okay, so you can easily lighten and darken colors. And if we look in our compiled CSS, let's just see where this is. So we want button primary, which is it's secondary. So button primary right here. Where is the back? I know this is kind of hard to read. Button primary right here, background color. So this hexadecimal is actually just it's a blue that's 10% lighter than what we set as our primary color. So it processes all of that, it pre-processes all of that, and then outputs it in the CSS. So pretty cool. So what I want to do next is show you a bit of functions and conditionals. We're actually going to use them at the same time, because I want to show you if I go to my config, right, which has all my variables, and let's say I want to change the primary color. Let's say I want to change it to something that is lighter. So let's actually what we'll do is copy this down and comment that out and then change this value. So let's change this to E. We'll do E0FFFF, which is like a very, very light blue, almost gray or white. So if I save that and we take a look, it changes our primary color, but the text is white, right? So I mean, this is unreadable. So I want to create a function that will actually look at the lightness of the background color and then return a specific text color based on that. So if it's a light background, then I want this to be a dark color text. If it's a dark background, then have it be a light color text. And this is actually one of my favorite, I guess, snippets when using Sass is being able to do this. So since it's a function, I'm going to put it in my config. And we just put a comment here and we'll say set text color based on background. So the way we create a function is with @function, and let's call this set-text-color. And this is going to take in here a parameter of color. So it's a variable, so we need a money sign. So it's basically the background color, and then we want to check the lightness of it. We can do that with Sass, and we can use a conditional by saying @if something, and then we can do an else with @else something. And what we want to check here is the lightness. Okay, so we have lightness and darkness, and we want to check to see if the lightness of the color that's passed in is greater than, let's do 70. okay, because it's, you know, 1 through 100 or whatever. So we're going to check to see if the lightness is greater than 70. So meaning if it's a light color, then let's do a return. So we can say at return, and we can return, let's do 333, which is a, you know, a dark color. Else, then let's at return white. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and now we should be able to use this function wherever we want. So the first place that I want to use this is right in our showcase. So let's go to our style.scss and go right down here. So we have our background color, and we have this manually set to white. So I'm going to actually change this. Instead of white, we're going to use our set text color function. And remember, it gets taken in a background color, which in our case is primary color. So now if I save this and we go back, now notice that the text in the showcase is dark. Now these links aren't, so what we would probably want to do is go and say, you know, any links in here, and we can go ahead and set that as well based on the primary color, which is the background of the showcase. So if I save that, we go back, you can see now these are dark as well. Now we can cut this, we can make this even less, so we can turn these two lines into one by creating a mix-in. So this is something else that I do quite often. So I'll go to my config here and create a mix-in to set the background color, but this set background mix-in will also implement this set text color. Okay, so let's put a comment here and say set background and text color. So remember, a mix-in it's like a function, but it doesn't actually return anything. So let's say mix-in set background, we'll call it, set background. And just like a function, it takes in, let's put a color, it takes in a color, and then we'll set that background color to whatever that color is, and then we'll also set the color of the text here, and we'll implement that set text color and pass in whatever that background color is. So now we can save this, and we can go back into our style sheet here, and instead of using both of these lines here, we can simply set, or include I should say, because it's a mix-in, we have to include set background, and then just pass in whatever the background color is for this element, which is primary. So now if I save this and I go back, you can see it sets the background and the text matches. It's dark if it's light, and it's going to be light if it's dark. All right. So let's also implement this in the buttons, because right now you can see that this has white text on a light color, because this is based, remember, this is based on the primary color. So in buttons, let's go down here, and let's see. What we can do is we're actually going to get rid of this, but for now we'll just go under it and say include set background. Now the background in this case is going to be the lightened primary color, so we can actually take this and pass it right in there, and then we can just get rid of this. Okay, we can do the same down here. Okay, and all we need is secondary color, because that's the background of this button. So now let's save that. And okay, so this is still white, and that is because of this right here. So basically this is overwriting it, this A. We don't actually need this anymore. So if we get rid of that, now you can see the button, the text color is gonna be based on the background. So now if I go and I set in config, let's set our primary color back to the original, the blue, and go back, all the text is the right color. Okay, so the text is white again. So now it doesn't matter what shade your background is, your text is going to reflect, or it's going to be the opposite of whatever the background is. Now the next thing I want to show you is something I haven't even mentioned yet, and that's in each loop. We actually have loops in Sass, and I'm going to use it to create margin and padding classes. So what I've done here is I just added margin on the top and bottom of the paragraph itself, and that is, let's see, right here. So I have margin top and bottom 20 pixels. I'm actually going to get rid of that, and if we go back, now that padding is gone. So, or that margin is gone. Now in my index.html, you'll notice I have a class of my1 on my paragraph. And what I want to have is the ability to say my1 through my5, so my-1, -2, -3, and have that be different values of margin on the top and bottom. If I want margin all around, I want to be able to do m1. So that would do, you know, a certain amount of margin around everything, around all sides. Same thing with padding, P1 or PY1. So instead of having to type all that out, in Sass we can actually create a loop. So I'm going to go into my config and I'm going to do that here. So let's say margin and padding classes. And obviously I wouldn't do this if this were all I was doing was this one little header, but if I wanted these classes to be available throughout my project, then this is something that can, you know, it's more efficient than typing it all out. So first thing I'll do is create a variable, and obviously I'm doing this to show you how to do it. So let's say space amounts, and we can set this to a list, and in this list I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and then down here what we'll do is we'll loop through this list. So let's say at each, and we'll say space, variable space, that's what we'll call this, in. So it's just like a JavaScript for in loop or in Python or something like that. So let's say space amounts and open up some curly braces. So now we have access. It's going to loop through here and we have access to each of these numbers, and it's going to be called space. So I'm going to create some classes. This one here is going to be .m dash, and then whatever that space is, and the way we can access each iteration, each number, is with a number sign and then curly braces, kind of like a template literal in JavaScript, and we'll say space. So this will create m-1, -2, all the way up to 5. And what I want to have as a property here is margin, and I'm going to set it to whatever that space number is in rem units. Okay, so that will do all around margin. And then what I'll do is copy this down, and this one, let's call this one my dash space, and then this is going to be just the top and bottom. So we just want to put a 0 here because it'll be whatever that space is in rems, top and bottom, 0 left and right. And you could even do like mx if you wanted to do on the sides. Okay, just like how Bootstrap has these classes. And then let's do padding. Actually, I'll just grab these, and let's say this will be P and PY, and then this will be padding and padding. Okay, so if I save this and then we look at our compiled CSS and we look at the top here, oh, that's not right. It shouldn't say space. What did I do wrong? Oh, I forgot the $sign. So back in config, we actually need to have the $sign because that signifies the variable inside here. Yeah, here too. Okay, so we'll save that, and now let's take a look at the CSS, and we have m-1, which is margin 1 rem all around. my1 is margin 1 rem top and bottom. We have p1, padding all around. So it created all of these classes for us. So we didn't actually have to type them out, and we can use these anywhere. And in the index.html, we're already using my1, and if we take a look, we have 1 rem padding. In fact, if I open up my tools here, and let's look at the CSS. So my1, we have margin 1 rem on the top and bottom. So we have those utility classes all throughout. We could in fact put that in the utilities. Actually, that's probably a better place to put it. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but I think that would be a better place to put it. So in utilities, because that's what these are, they're basically utility classes. So that should still work. All right, now the last thing I want to do is make this responsive, because right now this doesn't look too good. So let's, what I usually do, and this whole course is basically what I prefer doing. There's so many ways to do this stuff, but this is just what I like. So I usually create an underscore mobile.scss, which will have my media queries. Sometimes I'll have like a tablet and a mobile, but this is simple enough. We're just going to do a 700 pixel media query. So at media, and let's set the max width 700 pixels. So basically any screen that is less than 700 pixels, let's go ahead and take the showcase, and instead of a 600 pixel height, let's make it 400 pixels. And then the showcase content, so we can do dash content. I want to align it all to the center on small screen, so text align center. And then the image, which is also in the content, I'm going to set to display none, because I don't even want to show it on small screens. And then I'll bring it into my main style CSS. However, I'm not going to put it up here. I'm going to put it at the bottom where I usually put my media queries. So wherever you put this is where it'll show up in the compiled CSS. I mean, you might even want to put like your utilities and stuff. Yeah, we could do that. Just keep the config at the top, because that's where the variables are. So we could do that and save. And if we look at our compiled CSS, okay, so now we have all the utilities and stuff down at the bottom. We should have our media query, which is right here. It's hard to read, but here's the media query down at the bottom. And if we take a look at our site, we probably want to push that down a little. Actually, I want to do that anyways, even on larger screens. Push the showcase content down a little. So let's see, we have showcase, and then we have the showcase content. So we'll add, let's say, margin top, maybe 30 pixels. Yeah, so I think that's fine. It doesn't really matter. This doesn't have to be perfect. And I mean, the main point isn't to build this thing. It's just to get you to learn how Sass works with variables and partials and all this stuff. All right, so hopefully this helped you understand Sass a little bit. I know that we wrote some other CSS and we did some other things, but hopefully the parts that are important really stuck out. And one important thing to mention is you don't deploy this SCSS folder. These are your development files. Okay, this is your source code. You don't deploy that. A lot of times they'll have a separate folder called dist or something like that. Excuse me, or build, and you'll have your CSS and HTML, and then you'll have this outside of it, because all you need is this one file right here with these lines of CSS. Okay, so, but yeah, that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed this and learned something from it, and I'll see you in the next video.